Welcome to Therapist Spotlight.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Anta's Therapist Spotlight, the podcast where we aim to showcase our wonderful members to the wider community. I'm your host Joshua Brooks, and with us today is the lovely Megan Pfeffer. I'm sorry, I know that I mucked that up. She's a clinical nutritionist who specializes in the ketosis diet for women with lymphedemia. So this is going to be a great conversation, regardless of my tongue-tiedness. Megan, how are you going?
I'm really well, thanks, Joshua. It's nice here to be chatting with you, and don't worry, you've got that all out of the way now. The rest will be smooth sailing.
Well, we can only hope. So, first question, how did you get into natural health and natural medicine?
Well, my mum has always been interested in nutrition, so we were always sort of exposed to it growing up. And then it was really sort of in my early 40s that, well, probably earlier than that, I should take that back a little bit. I started reading up on low-carb nutrition. My mum introduced me to a book by David Gillespie, which was called Sweet Poison. And that was really my introduction to looking at nutrition through a different lens, I suppose. And I loved that aspect of it. I loved the sort of science approach to looking at our health and how foods affected you. And, you know, sugars weren't really talked about as far as being detrimental to your health. We were told that they gave you tooth cavities and, you know, that you shouldn't eat, you know, necessarily too much of them, but really that wasn't the focus. So to me, that made a lot of sense. And from there, being exposed to other people like dietitian Jennifer Elliott and Gary and Belinda Fetke, the three of them were really big role models for me as far as learning about low carb eating and insulin resistance and all of these things that, you know, I just found really fascinating. So I came about it through that way, I guess, and then wanted to do a health science degree in nutrition and as a career change. So my background really was in banking and finance. Found that really stressful, you know, working 7 days a week, and it just wasn't for me anymore. So I wanted a career change. So I left banking and finance, worked in hospitality for a few years because I loved food. Anything to do with food, I love. And so I did that, which I really enjoyed, while I tried to figure out what to do next. So really what came next was, well, I love nutrition, so why not study that? So that's how that came about. And of course, while I was studying nutrition, I really had to do my own research, because low carbohydrate eating, and particularly ketogenic diets, really wasn't touched on at uni. So I sort of, whilst I was doing my degree, I was also learning my own stuff and reading my own research and following lots of people who were leading the pathway forward in that space. Yeah,
wow. And so what really grabbed you about the ketogenic diet? Why did you sort of make that your specialty? How did that play into it? Yeah, what was the grabbing force of that?
So in my early 40s, which is when I started my health science degree, and I think a lot of uni people can relate to this, that getting towards the end of my degree, I was really unhealthy. You know, it was so stressful studying. I finished my full-time degree in 4 years. I actually lived 4 hours away from Melbourne, which is where I did my degree. So I had a 10-hour round trip every week to get there. And, you know, we were building a house and studying part-time. It was hugely stressful. And so subsequently my weight and my health declined. My weight went up, you know, quite a lot during that time. And I was mostly following, you know, really healthy eating patterns, but doing a lot of emotional stress eating in there as well. And so yeah, my weight was going up. So getting towards the end of my degree, I really, you know, realized that I had to start taking control of my health to be a good role model for what I was about to, you know, to start or embark on my career. And at the time, also, my mum, who's in her 70s, was actually was pre-diabetic, very close to being type 2 diabetic. And she had always had weight issues, and she had been, we had been following sort of low carb eating for a while. But I found with her that even though she was low carb eating, she was still binging on the carbs. So, you know, she'd still be eating too much sweet potato and too much of this and that, and you know, other foods were sneaking in, and it wasn't really working for her as well as it could have been. She was still, you know, in that pre-diabetic state. And so I said to Mum, look, I think keto, I've been, you know, obviously I've been looking into it a lot. I think this could be really what we both need. So in my last semester, I was staying with my mum down in the city because we were in student clinic and doing crazy hours. And so we started that together, and it just suited us. It worked really, really well. When you take away the carbohydrates completely to people who are carbohydrate intolerant and can either just overeat them or their body just doesn't like them, you know, because you have this, you know, over insulin response. So that the ketogenic diet can just work beautifully. So we found that it did for us. It reversed Mum's type 2 diabetes. She also had really severe osteoarthritis in her hands, where she was finding it difficult to close, you know, to bring her fingers down. There were rings that she hadn't been able to wear for years. She gained a lot of her hand and mobility left in her hands. She can hold knives and forks. She can wear rings that she hadn't been able to. So that anti-inflammatory sort of component of the ketogenic diet, which is one of the reasons why I love it so much, for those anti-inflammatory benefits. It just worked, and I lost nearly 20 kilos. And it helped to regulate my blood sugars and insulin levels as well.
And so then why the specialty with women's lymphedemia? What grabbed you about that specific sort of avenue with the ketogenic diet?
Yeah, so it's actually lipedema. So
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. But it's really easily confused because there's a condition called lipedemia, and that's a blood fat disorder. But lipedema is a fat and connective tissue disorder. So very similar names, but quite different diseases or conditions. And
thanks for picking me up on that.
That's okay. And so when I was set up my own clinic, I had someone come to me who had both lipedema and lymphedema. And when lipedema progresses onto lymphedema, usually caused by obesity, we then call it lipolymphedema, which is the combination of the two. So she came to me with lipolymphedema and had been using a keto diet and wanted some help with it. And so I, of course, didn't know what lipedema was. I didn't know what lipolymphedema was because it's not taught. It's not taught in medical schools. It's certainly not taught in a health science degree. So, you know, not that unusual to not know about it. So I started researching it. Came across a webinar that was on keto for lipedema. Couldn't believe my luck. Attended the webinar, made some comments during the webinar to the woman running it, and she picked up on that and said, "Oh, you're a nutritionist from Australia." She was, really interested, and then so we got to talking, and she said, "Okay, I want to do a webinar with you." So it kind of all kicked off from there. That I then joined their team. So the last few years I've been working with this organisation in America, and we've been helping women really all around the world. So raising awareness. So we were doing masterclasses and webinars and attending international conferences, and we put together a practitioners training for some integrative doctors in Italy, and we also co-authored a paper which was on the ketogenic diet as a potential intervention for lipedema. So that was kind of how that all came about. So it kind of sometimes the path just leads you somewhere, and that's where it led me. And of course I just found it fascinating. When I was doing the research for my client, I actually realised I had lipedema myself. So that's where the passion also came into it. Because when I was reading about the disproportionate, so lipedema is typically disproportionate weight gain for women. So it's often misdiagnosed as either obesity or lymphedema. So it's that, that sort of gynoid fat distribution on the lower half of the body. It can be in the arms as well, sometimes the stomach. But it's that disproportionate weight gain, and it's often described as painful fat. So unlike obesity, lipedema can be very painful. It has nodules under the skin, and kind of they can be like a grain of rice. they can be like beanbag balls, depending on what size they are. Sometimes they're even bigger, depending on how progressed it is. But they can be very painful to touch. And so sometimes there's also easy bruising. So a lot of women will really start relating when they start hearing, okay, yes, I've got that. I've always thought my legs are bigger than other people's. I always knew something wasn't right. Yes, my legs are painful. They're not always painful, but most women's are. That easy bruising is quite common as well, and also orthostatic edema. So starting to get that edema in your ankles and legs for standing for long periods of time, which is resolved by overnight sleeping.
And so, is it just predominantly women that get it, or do men get it as well?
Yeah, well, men do get it with severe sort of hormonal imbalances. Men do get it. They actually say it's very, very rare in men, but I think that might change over time. We don't hear about it a lot in men, but when you're in circles, with big sort of social circles that are women talking, a lot of them talk about that they know men with the condition, and in numbers that previously I think perhaps bigger than what we anticipated. But even with women, the numbers are surprisingly large. It affects 11% of women worldwide. Yeah, wow. So that's a really big, significant number. And I think in Australia, it's perhaps a little better recognised. Sometimes it's recognised, but not really knowing how to treat it. And because typically people are told it's not treatable with diet and exercise. It doesn't respond to diet and exercise. So, and that's true to a certain degree. It depends on what type of diet. And so, calorie restricted diets don't work. I mean, that doesn't really work for anyone. You need to find something obviously that's sustainable long term. But calorie restricted diets, women will lose the weight from their non-lipedema areas. So they're usually their top half, because they've normally got fairly thin waists to start with. Their top half will be quite small, but their bottom half will be bigger. So it sort of pronounces that disproportionate weight even more, because they lose it from the non-lipedema areas, but it stays in the lipedema areas.
So then is it sort of more an estrogen driver then that causes it, or what, if it's predominantly in women, or is it, why is that?
Yeah, well, they think there's a genetic component to it, because it is familial, and there is also a hormonal component, because it does mostly affect women, and it often affects women during times of hormone fluctuations, in times such as puberty. For some women, it can affect them as young as puberty, and for others, it can be around it can be pregnancy. And for other people, it can be menopause and post-menopause. And so those times of big hormone fluctuations, but also times of trauma. So I think whether that's emotional or physical trauma, so, stress really impacts the condition as well. So it's certainly a combination of those things can really impact it.
So if I'm a person sitting here listening to this interview, how would I know that I may be experiencing this and to seek you out? Is there like an easy test to do, to be like, well, my GP said I'm fine, but I would like a second opinion? What can people know to maybe look you up and contact you? What's the sort of the symptom signs or anything like that?
Well, the symptoms are, as I was describing, I think a lot of women will relate to that. So that will just resonate with a lot of people. And so if it does, have a chat, follow it up to see if it relates to you. As we said, not a lot of GPs know about it. Certainly look online. You can certainly contact me. I deal obviously all day, every day with women with lipedema and have it myself, which helps with managing the condition and understanding what women go through, because when you've got a really severe fat disorder, you can imagine the emotional difficulties that you face when the only advice you're being told is to stop eating so much. And that's a really common thing to happen. So it's that makes it really, really difficult. And there's a lot of emotional hurt and not being believed that you're not eating a lot. A lot of the women I see actually aren't eating enough. They've down-regulated their metabolism so much over the years from severe calorie restriction and dieting that they're no longer eating enough calories. There is sometimes emotional eating and binge eating in there when things, everything they're trying isn't working, but that's not the case for everyone. So yes, I would certainly say to find someone who is familiar with the condition. Sometimes seeing a physical therapist or an occupational therapist can be helpful because there are specific treatments for women with lymphedema. It's different to obesity, and you do need, there's lymphatic involvement, so they think the lymphatic system is compromised. So even for women who aren't necessarily experiencing lymphedema, there's that lymphatic component to it. So you really do need to start incorporating that. It's kind of a multimodality approach, really, as far as treatment is concerned. But there is no test that you can go to your doctor and say, please test me for lymphedema. It's really based on those signs and symptoms, and then seeking someone who is familiar with the condition to help with it.
Yeah, and so then how does a treatment plan look then? So obviously some form of the keto diet, but how does that look and how does that roll out for most people? Are you really deeply meal planning so that they know exactly what their macros are and exactly what they're eating and that kind of thing? Or is there a specific protocol where they have to abide by a very strict diet in order to keep this? Are you ketone esters? Are you doing that kind of thing? How does it look in your work to treat it? Yeah.
So as far as keto, one of the beauties of a ketogenic diet is it helps to self-regulate the appetite. And so often I'm encouraging women to eat a little more. So, I like to make sure that they're getting their protein targets generally. So, with keto, you need to get, to be eating under 50 grams of carbohydrates, total carbohydrates, generally, to get into nutritional ketosis. That's what, once you drop your carbohydrate levels, the central nervous system after 3 days will say, okay, we've got to find an alternative fuel source, and it will go over to change to fat burning with fatty acids and ketones. And so that takes a few days to happen. But for women with lymphedema, we believe that they're actually more insulin sensitive. And that can be regardless of systemic insulin. If there's systemic insulin resistance, which there often is, but there's localized insulin sensitivity. And that can get a bit complex, I think, that concept for some, but it means that the fat cells are really able to, to store a lot of fat. And the cell hypertrophies and keeps expanding, which sets off an inflammatory response. So obviously you need to deal with chronic inflammation, and you really need to be addressing hormones and insulin resistance. Quite often people will say keto is not an appropriate diet for women with lipedema and lymphedema because there's a compromised lymphatic system, and why would you want to put all of these fats into the lymphatic system if it's struggling anyway? But actually studies show that the fats are so important to the immune system. The immune system will actually have fat deposits around to give it quick access to fuel. It fuels itself on fatty acids. And so, studies will show that actually having fats in the lymphatic system is really important. And even in the absence of those fats, if you just feed MCT oils, for example, which bypass, obviously, then the normal, the lymphatic system, that they will still find MCTs in the lymphatic system because it's so important that they think that it will pull, the immune system will kind of pull it into that. So so that's why we do think that the ketogenic diet is really appropriate for this condition. But we think that keeping insulin really low is one of the main things we need to focus on. So that's why we choose a keto diet, is because that's essentially what you're doing, keeping insulin really low to stop that lipogenesis, that continuing, fat deposits. You want to be able to access that fat and break it down, the lipolysis. So keeping carbohydrates super low sometimes for women who are extra sensitive. Removing vegetable oils is an absolute priority. So when we talk about high fats, keto isn't actually really high fats. It can be for some people, like if you're using it for epilepsy, for example, and and it's someone who doesn't want to lose weight, they're using it though to help with brain health, then sure, you're wanting to have really high fats. But if you have someone who's morbidly obese, you don't really necessarily want them having high fats, but you do want them having healthy fats, enough to give that satiety, to get between meals without snacking. And so so the focus really has to be on the healthy fats as a priority. And I think most health practitioners would do that anyway. But, we really are taught vegetable oils, polyunsaturated fats are good for you, and saturated fats aren't a great thing. But, we know that, or also what research is sort of showing, that as far as the adipocyte is concerned, the fat cells, when they get too much polyunsaturated fats, it actually creates insulin sensitivity in the fat cell. Now, you'd think that would be a good thing, but we really want the fat cell to be insulin resistant. We don't want it to continually be, expanding and just storing extra fats in there. So we want a degree of insulin resistance. Vegetable oils disrupt that, and saturated fats actually help that. So the insulin, so the vegetable oils will provide this insulin sensitivity, which we don't really want, and then it will also cause systemic insulin resistance. So that's, that whole picture that we're trying to avoid. So it's super important to get rid of those. Moderate amounts of protein. I think some people think that it's a really high protein diet. That's not the case. It's just a moderate protein, like any healthy diet would be. And then the fats are really up to the individual on, having to usually overcome that cognitive dissonance, as we call it, where people have been told to avoid fats their whole lives and to avoid salt their whole lives, and suddenly we're putting them into a ketogenic diet and we're asking them to eat these things that they've been told, and quite often are still being told by their medical team not to have. So you need to be really up to date with your science on lipid profiles and what a ketogenic diet can actually do to help improve lipid profiles, because they will ultimately sometimes raise cholesterol, raise LDL cholesterol. For some people it all goes down. For others it will raise them. Anyway, that's a whole other story. I go into a lot of detail, but we know that there are a lot of improvements in lipid profiles, which is really important for people to grasp, because particularly for women with lipedema, often have a big medical team around them because they have comorbidities, and they'll have an endocrinologist and a cardiologist and that sort of thing. So you need to be able to really feel comfortable, I think, dealing with people at that level. But one of the other big things, of course, is lifestyle medicine. We look at this holistically. We really you really need to be addressing stress. Stress is a really big part of these women's lives. And in my clinical experience, they're often not sleeping well. They're going to bed at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So that, poor sleep, that high stress, and not eating enough, so not getting enough nutrients, and there'll be nutrient deficiencies, like certainly vitamin D is a big one, and that's a good starting point for anyone who's overweight. And various other nutritional deficiencies for some women, depending too on whether they've had bariatric surgery or not, because quite often when there's a lot of obesity, then they've already been down that route of trying lap band surgery or bariatric surgery. And of course that leads to a whole lot of nutrient deficiencies as well.
For sure, yeah, especially because, like you were saying, calorie restriction isn't necessarily a good path to go down, and that seems to be what bariatric surgery leads you to, is calorie deficiency. So
absolutely. And as far as women with lipedema are concerned, it doesn't touch the lipedema fat, because still, if they're still eating the same foods which are high, which are spiking the insulin, is stopping the lipolysis, then you're not able to access that fat.
And it's wonderful. Like a lot of the research now, Dr. David Veitch is one of my people that I look at quite often. A lot of his different papers on the Krebs cycle and how it works. Well, I thought that was, it blew my mind when I started really diving into the ketogenic diet with him and all that kind of stuff. with yourself then, do you also like to supplement? Like, so will you give your clients a nutrient profile as well and then supplement different nutrients as they're coming in? Or do you just try and do that with the whole foods? How do you navigate that sort of space with clients that are coming to you and then you maybe have to pull them down into that ketosis? So yeah, how do you navigate that?
So I always start with whole foods, unless there's something really obvious and evident, and like I said, will normally be vitamin D, because numbers will always be low. But certainly, you know, always looking at blood test results and looking at MCVs and you know, starting there even to see, you know, the sizes of their red blood cells and that type of thing. But going on energy levels and, you know, so getting that nutrient profile and always having a look at B12 and folate. That's usually a big thing. And particularly with MTHFR, I find that's really quite common in women with lymphedemia. And yeah, so I think it really depends on the individual, because some women don't have many symptoms. You know, leaky gut or gut intestinal permeability can be there quite a bit, and that's, you know, gut dysbiosis and those types of things, but it's not there with everyone. So, you know, it really, to me, I think I try to keep supplements minimized, but certainly, you know, magnesium, of course, is another one that's really useful, and that's quite often that I'll prescribe that. Quercetin can be a really good one too, and quite common. NAC, of course, as well. Yeah, and CoQ10. I mean, depending on the age of women as well and what sort of medications they're on. You know, if there's metformin, if they're too diabetic, if there's metformin, you know, looking at B vitamins and things, the B12s and deficiencies there. If they're on the oral contraceptive pill, of course, all of those medications lead to their own deficiency. So addressing, you know, whatever is going to be there for them. And then really, though, looking at the diet and what they're getting through the diet, and really trying to only supplement what's lacking through the diet. And if there's blood sugar dysregulation, I'm a fan of berberine. Yeah, so it really depends on what comorbidities they have.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I guess you've got that sort of that team, like you were saying, and trying to work in with what they're doing with the team and with the doctors and everything that they're being seen, that they're seeing, trying to get your medicine as well to work in with that, and not necessarily, sending them down a path of skew-free, I guess.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I don't like that one size fits all approach with supplements either. So it really does depend on the individual. You know, thyroid, there's a lot of thyroid problems with this group of women and things like that. Mast cell activation syndrome.
I guess the other question that I would have in regards to this is, how does exercise factor in? And do you also then look at like intermittent fasting as a protocol as well? I guess those are two questions, but how does that fit within your treatment plan for the women that you see?
Yeah, so I think both of those are really important. Exercise is really going to depend on where they are at the moment. If they're in the beginning stages and they're younger, where exercise is there, quite often you actually need to try to pull them back a bit on exercise because they don't like the size of their legs. They're madly trying to exercise it off. But that actually really aggravates lymphedema cells, and I think it can cause inflammation. So really sometimes having to pare that back a bit. Swimming is a fabulous thing to do for women with lymphedema, because the water acts as a compression, and that can be really helpful. So swimming is a great one. But for some women, I've had clients where we've started with getting them to walk to the mailbox. And, you know, I've had clients that have been typically wheelchair bound pretty much most of the time, not able to walk long distance, so they've been wheelchair bound. And so starting them with sometimes just putting on their sneakers, because that can sometimes make them feel like, okay, well, I've gone that far, I'll just walk out the front door, and sometimes even that's enough. And sometimes it's just raising a broom above their head, and, you know, if that's causing them to breathe heavy, then even that's enough, and it's just getting some basic movements. And so some people can't actually do much exercise because they're, you know, carrying so much extra weight on the bottom half of your body, causes so much pressure on your joints. that there is a lot of hip pain and knee pain, which makes exercising very difficult. So I just encourage women to get up out of their chairs every half an hour. So sometimes it's just a matter of getting the movement to be frequent, because of course the lymphatic system needs muscle movement to stimulate it. So getting them up and out of their chair every 20 minutes or 30 minutes can be really helpful as well. So that really depends on the degree of health. And I quite often will refer women to exercise physiologists so that they're exercising under medical supervision. That's really the best way, I think, particularly for women who haven't exercised for a while. It's a really good way to start.
I guess especially, like you said, there may be an incredible pain as well with a lot of the fat cells. So yeah, absolutely. Learning how to move around and do different exercises that may not aggravate the condition would be a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, then as far as intermittent fasting is concerned, I would generally, starting people on a form of intermittent fasting, which we really, refer to as time restricted eating, just getting people to stop snacking late at night. If a lot of people are staying up till 12 or 1 or 2 in the morning, so they're snacking until 12 or 1 or 2 in the morning, which messes with your hormones. And it's
I'm
really
guilty of that. I'm going to raise my hand.
But also, spiking that insulin, constantly grazing, and that's another thing. People often constantly graze because they've learnt to calorie restrict, which means they're not having a big meal at a time. They're having these small meals that they just take the edge off their hunger, and they go another hour or two and they have something else, and you've just got this constant spiking of their blood sugars and insulin. And a lot of people will say, well, the women with lymphedemia don't have blood sugar issues, but actually they've got an insulin issue going on in the background. It often takes longer to develop where you start seeing the blood sugars rise. But, if you were to look into the background, you'll see, or even to do, triglyceride to HDL ratios to look for that insulin resistance, it's there most often. And, so the time-restricted eating is a really good one to just start people gently. And ketogenic diets typically result in appetite regulation. So whereas when I first start people, I say, I really don't care how much you eat. Snack, do anything you need to just to get through carbohydrate cravings if you're having them. It doesn't matter what food you're having as long as it's keto. And because that it starts to self-regulate, and eventually, and it doesn't really take all of that long, but suddenly people who are eating 3 main meals and 2 snacks a day are now, down to 2 meals a day, and having their first meal of the day at 10 or 11 a.m. seems to be a really typical time where natural hunger occurs, not just slamming down a breakfast because you've been told it's the most important meal of the day, waiting for true hunger, listening to body signals. And so that really starts self-regulating, where people are kind of doing intermittent fasting, not even trying to, and then for others, sometimes working in maybe a 24-hour fast. I'm a fan of 24-hour fasts where you might go from dinner to dinner, so you're kind of not missing a meal, maybe a 36-hour fast. I'm not really, I've done 3-day fasts myself. I actually had breast cancer last year and went through chemotherapy at the end of last year, and did 3-day fasting through chemo, which was really beneficial and helped to keep side effects down. So I am a fan of fasting. I think it really depends what you're using it for, and some people actually enjoy going a few days without food. It's helpful. And it just works for them. Other people, like me, for example, I only did it because of chemo, but I love my food too much to go without it that long. And I can do a 24-hour fast every now and then, and I enjoy doing that. And I think the body really benefits. But even there are studies that show that people going just 13-hour fasts, which is pretty easy to go 8 o'clock at night, or 7 o'clock at night, or 8 o'clock the next morning, like that's not even considered that's just considered normal to a lot of people, but to some people that's challenging. But that 13-hour fast alone, regardless of what diet you're on, is really beneficial, and there's studies to show that it brings great health benefits. But of course, we haven't mentioned autophagy, which is another really beneficial thing to be going they say around 16 hours. I mean, it can happen at various times anyway, but, from sort of 16 hours onwards, you really kick into this autophagy mode. And I think for women with lymphedemia, that can be really beneficial, because you have, when the fat cells are getting so big, they get to that point of hypoxia and necrosis where they're not getting oxygen, and they're, pyroptosis which is inflammatory cell death, is kind of happening, and it's spilling these extracellular contents, inflammatory contents, into the extracellular space. And so you've got these additional proteins in the extracellular space that you don't really want. And so autophagy is very good for cleaning up proteins that shouldn't be there. And so I think that can be a really good thing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Megan. This has been a wonderful interview with so much information. So if any of the people out there listening feel like this could be a therapy that they could really, really help them, where can they find you? Where's the best place?
Well, you can find me. My web address. My business is called I Choose Health. So my web address is ichoosehealth.com.au. So go to my website and shoot me an email. I do 20-minute free chats for people, so that you can see whether this is something that might affect you, but also to see whether I might be the right health professional for you. I think it's a really nice thing to be able to chat to someone before committing to them, just to see if you click, because it's a big part of the healing relationship, I think, is finding someone that you really get along with and trust and feel like you've got a connection with. So feel free to reach out and have a chat.
And are you also open to other health practitioners contacting you to get your expert advice for their clients? So say if the client themselves aren't willing to open to you, are you willing to, if they want to go through their healthcare practitioner because they've got that relationship?
Yeah, I have had other practitioners book in with me for some sessions because they want to get that, that extra advice, because there's not a lot of information out there on it. And so I think, I think that can be really beneficial, talking to someone who has actually dealt with these women for a number of years to be able to, really be able to apply some techniques that work.
Absolutely. Well, we'd just like to thank you so much for coming on Therapist Spotlight, Megan. It's been absolutely wonderful. And of course, guys, as always, the links will be down in the description box below. But if you're a client and this sounds like something that you've been struggling with, please contact Megan and get her there. Or if you've got a therapist that you're already working with and they want a little bit more information about this, unknown sort of disorder, please, get in touch with Megan, and we can see what we can do with the networking. But we'd just like to thank you once again for coming on. And for everybody out there, have a good day, and we'll catch us all next time. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Therapist Spotlight. If you would like to know more about ANTA, visit us at www.anta.com.au.